Hazardous chemicals. They are found in more than 7 million workplaces, and over 55 million employees handle, use, or work around these potentially harmful substances throughout the U.S. While these substances are essential to many work processes in a variety of industries, they can also be very dangerous. Exposure to these chemicals can cause effects ranging from mild skin irritations to serious health problems, such as heart and organ damage or cancer. These chemicals present hazards, such as the potential to cause fires or explosions. To help us become aware of these hazards and to understand how to protect ourselves from them, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration has developed the Hazard Communication Standard. The Hazard Communication Standard establishes uniform requirements to make sure that hazard information is communicated to all employees and employers. Commonly referred to as HAZCOM, or the Right to Know law, this regulation gives you the right to know which chemicals are being used in your workplace and the possible dangers you are being exposed to. You also have the right to know how to protect yourself when using hazardous chemicals. As a part of the Hazard Communication Standard, your employer is required to provide you with the knowledge and training necessary for you to do your job safely. In 2012, OSHA aligned its Hazard Communication Standard with the United Nations Globally Harmonized System for Classification and Labeling Chemicals. While OSHA maintained the framework of its traditional HAZCOM standard, it adopted the GHS hazard definitions, safety data sheet, and labeling formats. GHS mandates a standard format for information on every hazardous chemical, and it is a worldwide standard for the countries that choose to use it. The HAZCOM standard mandates that your employer complies with 5 regulatory requirements. Develop a written program that describes what the HAZCOM program is and how it's implemented. Create an inventory of all hazardous chemicals at the workplace. Ensure each chemical has a GHS-style safety data sheet, or SDS, that is easily accessible to all employees who work with that chemical. Ensure each chemical container is properly labeled with a GHS-style approved label or an OSHA-compliant workplace label. And create and implement an employee HAZCOM training program. Some chemicals are explosive, corrosive, flammable, or toxic. Other chemicals are relatively safe to use and store but may become dangerous when they interact with other substances. To avoid injury and/or property damage, persons who handle chemicals must understand the physical and health hazards of the chemicals. A hazardous chemical is any chemical which is classified as a physical hazard or a health hazard, a simple asphyxiant, combustible dust, pyrophoric gas, or a hazard not otherwise classified. Physical hazards are those chemicals that can cause a fire, explosion, or some other violent reaction when they come into contact with air, water, or other chemicals. Chemicals that threaten people's health are called health hazards by entering the body in one of 3 ways: inhalation, skin contact, or ingestion. These chemicals can cause both short-term acute health problems and long-term chronic health problems. OSHA considers any chemical to be a health hazard if it is toxic, corrosive to the skin or eyes, a respiratory sensitizer, a cause of cancer, birth defects, or reproductive issues, harmful to specific organs in the body, and harmful or deadly when inhaled. OSHA requires that each company keep a complete and up-to-date inventory of its hazardous chemicals. This brief overview provides guidance to help workers who handle hazardous chemicals to become familiar with the format and understand the contents of the SDS. Employers must ensure that the safety data sheets are in English and readily accessible to employees at all times. The SDS includes information such as the properties of each chemical, the physical, health, and environmental health hazards, protective measures, and safety precautions for handling, storing, and transporting the chemical. A chemical manufacturer, distributor, or importer is required to provide safety data sheets for hazardous chemicals to communicate information on the hazards. The information is required in a consistent 16-section format. Section 1. Provides the product and company identification. It includes the official name of the chemical, as well as other names it goes by. Section 2. Identifies the hazards posed by the chemical, along with the information that's required to be on the chemical's label, including the pictograms, signal word, hazard statements, and precautionary statements. Section 3 details the composition of the chemical. Section 4 describes the treatment methods to use to help yourself or someone who has been exposed to the chemical. Section 5 describes the combustibility of the chemical, any possible secondary results if there is a fire, and how to put out a fire if this chemical is involved. Section 6 describes any special cleanup procedures in the event of a spill. Section 7 outlines the safe ways to work with and store the chemical. Section 8 shows the minimum amount of time a person can be exposed to the chemical before being potentially affected, and how to protect yourself through proper clothing and handling techniques. Section 9 describes the chemical's characteristics, such as its normal appearance, odor, solubility, melting and freezing points, flash point, evaporation rate, flammability, vapor pressure, and density. Section 10 describes how stable the chemical is, as well as the conditions that created instability. Section 11 identifies the degree in which the chemical is poisonous, as well as other potential health hazards. This section lists both acute and chronic health conditions that can result from overexposure to the chemical. Section 12 describes how the chemical interacts with the environment, including how long it will last, how it spreads, and any other pertinent information. Section 13 explains how the chemical should be discarded. Section 14 includes instructions on the safe and unsafe ways of moving the chemical. Section 15 describes the safety, health, and environmental laws specific to the chemical. And finally, Section 16 includes any additional details that are important to disclose regarding the chemical, as well as the date the SDS was prepared. Labels are an immediate source of information for the person working directly with a chemical. We should always read labels before starting to work with the chemical. The revised standard continues to allow employers the flexibility to use other alternative workplace labeling systems, such as the National Fire Protection Association 704 Diamond System or Hazardous Material Identification System. The GHS does not specify a label format or layout, but requires the inclusion of several elements. All hazardous material containers must be labeled, tagged, or marked with the following. Product identifier shows you how the hazardous chemical is identified. The same product identifier must be on the label and in Section 1 of the safety data sheet. Supplier identification should have the name, address, and telephone number of the chemical manufacturer, importer, or other responsible party. Signal words, either danger or warning, indicates the relative level of severity of the chemical's hazard. Hazard statement describes the nature of the hazards within a chemical, including where appropriate the degree of hazard. Precautionary statement describes measures to minimize or prevent adverse effects from exposure to a hazardous chemical or improper storage or handling. And pictograms provides a quick visual warning of chemical dangers. There are 9 pictograms. Health hazards indicate chemicals that are carcinogens, mutagenic, toxic, and that can cause respiratory sensitivity. Flame is used for flammables, pyrophorics, self-heating chemicals, flammable gas, self-reactives, and organic peroxides. Exclamation mark warns of skin and eye irritants, skin sensitizers, acute toxicity, narcotic effects, and respiratory tract irritants. Gas cylinder indicates gas under pressure. Corrosion warns that the chemical may cause skin corrosion, burns, eye damage, and is corrosive to metals. Exploding bomb is used for explosives, self-reactives, and organic peroxides. Flames over circle marks oxidizers. Skull and crossbones warns of fatal or acute toxicity. Environmental indicates aquatic toxicity. If a chemical has multiple hazards, different pictograms are used to identify the various hazards. It is extremely important that all containers of chemicals are properly labeled. All containers will have the appropriate label, tag, or marking prominently displayed. Portable containers which contain a small amount of chemical need not be labeled if they are used immediately and completely. If the portable container will be used by more than one employee or used over the course of more than one shift, the container must be labeled. All warning labels, tags, etc. must be maintained in a legible condition and not be defaced. Labels must be in English. Incoming chemicals are to be checked for proper labeling. And all materials will have the appropriate pictogram affixed to the label. The employer must ensure that each container of hazardous chemicals in the workplace is labeled, tagged, or marked with the identity of hazardous chemicals, and must show hazard warnings appropriate for employee protection. You should always review a container's label before using the chemical, to ensure that it is in fact the chemical you believe it to be. You never know when a container you think you are familiar with gets changed. OSHA requires that each person who works with hazardous chemicals be trained on the Hazard Communication Standard. This includes being trained on hazard chemical container labeling, safety data sheets, and the chemical inventory. Employers must provide employees with information and training on hazardous chemicals in their work area at the time of their initial assignment, and whenever a new hazard is introduced into their work area. All new employees must receive safety training covering the elements of the Hazard Communication and Right to Know program. Employees must receive on-the-job training from their employer as well. This training will cover the proper use, inspection, and storage of necessary personal protective equipment and chemical safety training for specific chemicals they will be using or will be working around. Annual Hazard Communication Refresher training must be conducted as a part of the employer's continuing safety training program. Immediate on-the-spot training. This training must be conducted by the employer for any employee that requests additional information or exhibits a lack of understanding of the safety requirements. Employees have the following rights under the Hazard Communication Program: to receive information regarding hazardous substances to which you may be exposed, access to your medical and exposure monitoring records, and protection against discharge or other discrimination due to exercising their right to know. Employers must develop, implement, and maintain at the workplace a written hazard communication program for their workplaces. Written hazard communication programs must include the following: a list of hazardous chemicals known to be present, the methods the employer will use to inform workers about labels and safety data sheets, the methods the employer will use to inform employees of the hazards of non-routine tasks, and methods the employer will use to provide other employers on-site access to safety data sheets on multi-employer sites. Hazardous non-routine tasks. Non-routine tasks are defined as working on, near, or with unlabeled piping, unlabeled containers of any unknown substance, confined space entry where a hazardous substance may be present, and/or a one-time task using a hazardous substance differently than intended. Before employees begin work on hazardous non-routine tasks, the employer must provide affected employees information about hazardous chemicals to which the employee may be exposed during such activity. The following general safety rules must be observed when working with chemicals. Read and understand the safety data sheets. Keep the work area clean and orderly. Use the necessary safety equipment. Carefully label each container with the identity of its content, appropriate hazard warnings, and pictograms. Store incompatible chemicals in separate areas. Substitute less toxic materials whenever possible. Limit the volume of volatile or flammable material to the minimum needed for short operation periods. And provide means of containing the material if equipment or containers should break or spill their contents. Each task that requires the use of chemicals should be evaluated to determine the potential hazards associated with the work. This hazard evaluation must include the chemical or combination of chemicals that will be used in the work, as well as other materials that will be used near the work. The separation of chemicals during storage is necessary to reduce the possibility of unwanted chemical reactions caused by accidental mixing. Use either distance or barriers to isolate chemicals into the following groups. Flammable liquids. Store in approved flammable storage cabinets. Acids. Treat as flammable liquids. Bases. Do not store bases with acids or any other materials. Other liquids. Ensure that other liquids are not incompatible with any other chemical in the same storage location. And lips, strips, or bars are to be installed across the width of the storage shelves to restrain the chemicals in case of an earthquake. Routes of entry. The way chemicals get into the body is called routes of entry. These include inhalation, ingestion, and absorption through the skin or eyes. There are safety measures we can take to prevent chemicals from entering our bodies. Proper ventilation or respirators can reduce inhalation. Keep food and beverages out of a work area, and make sure we wash our hands before eating can prevent ingestion. Always wear the proper protective equipment specified by the container label or safety data sheet. Wearing protective equipment, such as goggles with a face shield, gloves, aprons, and boots to prevent absorption. Respiratory protection may also be required to avoid breathing in hazardous fumes. And, if you are unsure about the required PPE for any chemical, stop and ask your supervisor. You should always have a spill response plan in place prior to working with hazardous chemicals. However, you should not attempt to clean up a spill if the spilled material is unknown or highly toxic, you lack the knowledge or necessary equipment to do the cleanup safely, the spill is large and cannot be contained with a small spill kit, and you are experiencing symptoms of exposure. The chemical manufacturer, importer, or employer must immediately disclose the specific chemical identity of a hazardous chemical to a treating physician or nurse when the information is needed for proper emergency or first aid treatment. Here are 5 key points you must remember about OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard. Create an inventory of all hazardous chemicals in the workplace. Ensure each chemical has a GHS-style safety data sheet, or SDS, that is easily accessible to all employees who work with that chemical. Ensure each chemical container is properly labeled with a GHS-styled approved label or an OSHA-compliant workplace label. Create and implement an employee hazard communication training program. And develop a written program that describes how the hazard communication program has been implemented. Shifting our mindsets toward hazard communication is perhaps the most important factor in influencing safe chemical handling in the workplace. Unfortunately, it's all too common for companies to manage safety to the minimum OSHA standards. But here's the thing. You can be 100% compliant with these standards and still be plagued with poor injury performance and the multitude of costs associated with it. We all know that if a worker is rushing or frustrated when working with chemicals, then this state of mind is going to put them at a greater risk of injury or illness, even if they were properly trained and provided with a copy of the company's written hazard communication program. Simply satisfying OSHA's hazard communication compliance guidelines does not prevent incidents from occurring. The better course of action is to shift the safety culture from a compliance mindset to one centered on fostering an environment in which people are committed to consciously seeking safe ways to work. Here's what committing to a culture of safety looks like. We reduce the likelihood of injury or illness to employees by implementing specific procedures to identify and evaluate the chemical hazards in the workplace. Employees are key members in helping to develop safe work methods. We conduct field observations to monitor how safety measures look in practice and routinely conduct audits to verify our capabilities. We ensure that all affected individuals are adequately informed about the chemicals used and stored in their workplaces. And finally, we shift employees' attitudes toward chemical safety in that engaging in safe work practices and procedures are a non-negotiable. Work doesn't begin until we understand the inherent risks associated with each chemical we use. Not because it's what OSHA says we should do, but because we sincerely believe that it is good for all of us.